Good afternoon, and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy's Fierce Urgency of Now series. We're delighted to welcome you back this fall after a brief hiatus this summer. And to launch our conversation this fall, we are delighted to welcome back Priscilla Ocen, who is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she teaches criminal law, family law, and a seminar on race, gender, and the law. Her work explores the ways in which race, gender, and class interact to render women of color invisible and vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. Her writing has appeared in numerous academic journals, such as the California Law Review, the UCLA Law Review, the George Washington Law Review, UC Davis Law Review, and the Du Bois Review. She received the inaugural PEN America Writing for Justice Literary Fellowship, and it was a Fulbright Fellow in 2019 to 2020, based out of Makerere University in Kampala, where she studied the relationship between gender-based violence and women's incarceration. Ocen is the co-author, along with Kimberly Crenshaw and Jyoti Nanda, of the influential policy report, Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Over-Policed, and Underprotected. The report was part of a larger effort co-organized by Ocen and others to highlight the various forms of discipline and punishment experienced by Black girls. So thank you so much for joining us today, Priscilla, and we look forward to your sharing some opening remarks with us on intersectionality, how it's defined, its relevance, and its impact, and then we'll have some questions for you, both from myself as well as from our audience.
Thank you so much, Sushma, for having me. I think, as I mentioned to you and Larissa, I'm coming to you from Los Angeles County here after having chaired a meeting on policing for the last 4 hours, particularly the operation of our Sheriff's Department, which is one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. It's also, from my perspective, one of the most violent and corrupt. And so it's really a pleasure to come and talk to you all after concluding that meeting about intersectionality. And I think it's quite apt because intersectionality has deeply influenced my thinking about questions like state power and policing, and how we can really analyze state power and the way in which power operates in society, because that's what intersectionality is. It is an analysis of power. That was inaugurated by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia, in a series of articles in the 1980s. One is called Demarginalizing the Intersection, and the other is called Mapping the Margins, where she lays out this theory of intersectionality, where she coined the term intersectionality. And in Demarginalizing, it's a critique of law. It's a critique of courts and how they analyze anti-discrimination claims in ways that invisibilize women of color, and in particular, Black women, because of how race is constructed, because of how gender is constructed along the lines of what she calls a single axis, right? So in contextualizing the claims of Black people in the workplace, right, it's contextualized around the claims of Black men, particularly in the cases that she described in the piece. And in contextualizing the gender discrimination claims that she analyzes in the piece, she talks about the ways in which the court analyzes gender discrimination claims along the lines of white women's experiences. And as a result of this single axis framework, the way in which the courts construct race on the one hand or construct gender on the other, the lived experiences, the kinds of discrimination that's experienced by Black women is completely rendered invisible. Therefore, it repeats. Therefore, the injuries are never redressed, and Black women continue to be systematically subordinated. Now, the claims that Crenshaw made in Demarginalizing the Intersections are not unique to Black women, obviously, right? That single axis framework operates in similar ways with regard to Indigenous communities, with regard to Latinx communities, and Latinx Indigenous women, and Latinx women and Indigenous women, with regard to folks with disabilities, and folks who are trans and queer, right? So we can talk about other ways in which the single axis construction of law operates as a means of structural power.
Here's what I found.
oh, sorry, that was my phone, to exclude the most vulnerable, right? In this case, it was Black women. And in mapping the margins, which was the second piece that Crenshaw wrote, I believe that was in the early 1990s, she extends that critique to social movements and identity politics, and talks about the ways in which the single axis framework that we see in law also extends to social movements in terms of anti-racist movements or feminist movements who define their demands around the individuals and communities who are the most privileged, right? So in terms of anti-racist movements, we often see the demands articulated in terms of the perspectives and experiences of Black men who are not burdened by gender, who necessarily, we can query that, but who are not necessarily impacted by, who are cisgender, who are heterosexual, who are able-bodied, right, who are the most privileged within the group, and therefore those who experience the most profound forms of subordination and state and the expressions of state power are rendered voiceless. And we can say the same about feminist movements. The argument was that the same sort of dynamics operate with regard to feminist movements, where white women are leading the conversations about what constitutes reproductive rights or reproductive justice, for example, in ways that exclude the experiences of Indigenous, Black, Latinx, disabled, trans, and other women within the category of women, and who are counted as constituents of the feminist movement, but silenced within it. And she used the example of domestic violence centers who, again, would claim to serve the needs of women broadly, but through the operation of their programs, excluded those who most needed their services, like Black women and Latinx women in LA County. So that was the impetus of intersectionality in terms of the phrase that we use today, or the theoretical framework. But it came as a result of longstanding arguments made by Black feminist theorists, right? Like the Combahee River Collective, people like Bell Hooks or Angela Davis, who talked about the ways in which, for example, double jeopardy impacted Black women and made them vulnerable to both public and private violence because of the ways that they were excluded from conversations about racial power, from conversations about patriarchy, from conversations about structural economic inequality, and the like. And so this is intersectionality, in other words, is a product not only of critical race theory and not only a product of the brilliant mind of people like Kimberly Crenshaw, but it's also a legacy of long-standing critiques made by Black feminist theorists. And so I hope that folks can understand the way in which Black feminist theory has really contributed a significant degree to our thinking and understanding about power, and how power operates on different kinds of bodies and on different kinds of communities, differentially, depending on how they're located and where they're located, and the ways in which elision and invisibility is a mechanism of power that renders those communities continually powerless. So that's my brief description of intersectionality, and I think its importance.
So that's very helpful, thank you. And I should say to our audience that I first met you, Priscilla, at the summer school on intersectionality that was organized by Professor Crenshaw and featured you as a professor, as well as Robin D.G. Kelly and others, Devin Carbado. So I feel as a lifelong learner, I was really able to learn from the best in this space. So I understand very well what you are talking about when it comes to social movements and community organizations. But I'm wondering if you can give a couple of examples, both from the law, when you talk about anti-discrimination claims and looking at the single axis framework. Are there a couple of examples you can give in that context, as well as from the sort of social movement, civil society context, to better contextualize this for our audience?
Sure. And I'll actually take some examples from Demarginalizing the Intersection with regard to the legal critique. And then I'll talk about some of the ways in which intersectionality has both critiqued social movements and informed contemporary social movements like abolition, disability justice, reproductive justice, and the like. So first, let me start with the legal critique, right, that Professor Crenshaw lays out in Demarginalizing the Intersection. So one of the examples she gives is around employment discrimination. And in particular, she discusses a case called DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. And in that case, you had two claims that were being made by employees of General Motors who alleged they were being systematically and structurally discriminated against, prevented from experiencing promotions, from being or for even being hired. So there were two classes. One was a class alleging race discrimination, and the other class was a class alleging gender discrimination. And you had Black women. So you had Black men who were being hired, but not placed into certain kinds of employment categories, and not given opportunities for promotion. And then you had white women who were experiencing similar kinds of discrimination. They were being tracked into low-level clerical kinds of tasks and not given opportunities to compete for positions in higher-paying jobs that involved more rigorous physical work. Black women, however, were not even being hired at all, right? So you had Black men and white women who were being hired, but limited in terms of their ability to ascend within the company. And then you had Black women who were not being hired at all. And so Black women were making claims, who were attempting to make claims about employment discrimination regarding their own particular experiences. And they sought to represent the classes of, in terms of race discrimination and also in terms of gender discrimination, because it wasn't just one or the other. They weren't being discriminated against just because they were Black. They weren't being discriminated against just because they were women. They were being discriminated against because they were Black women. And so the court, when the class of Black women tried to represent the race claims, the court said, no, that's too different from the way in which Black men are being discriminated against. When they tried to represent the gender claims, the court said, no, you can't represent the gender class because, again, that's too different from the way in which white women are experiencing discrimination. So it's not clear that this is simply a question of gender. And so Black women were really left without a remedy. And their invisibility contributed to the ongoing discrimination that they faced in the workplace. And obviously, that's not just about General Motors. That speaks to how law itself adjudicates claims of discrimination or adjudicates claims of structural harm along the lines of race or gender, right? At the time, the law didn't really recognize these sort of intersectional harms, right? And it was after Crenshaw made her intervention that the law began to expand how it understands discrimination and the way in which discrimination can be intersectional and compounded. Again, not just about Black women, but it's about broader structural dynamics within the law. So that's one point about how the law operates in ways that are aligned with this sort of single axis framework to perpetuate ongoing discrimination. And I want to note here that the claim isn't just about identity categories, right? Because it's a critique of how law constructs identity categories, but it is not an argument about the creation of identity categories, right? That we need to create special categories for Black women. Rather, it's a critique that argues that we need to better understand how the power of law is operating in the first place by constructing these identities and then rendering them invisible, right? She made similar claims about how social movements operate, and in particular, looking at sort of paradigmatic civil rights claims, where Black women's experiences, for example, in the workplace or with sexual assault or with domestic abuse and other forms of structural violence were not elevated as part of broader claims for racial redress, for example, or the way in which Black women's experiences or Indigenous women's experiences, Latinx women's experiences, people with disabilities experiences were excluded from feminist arguments about reproductive rights that focus almost exclusively on abortion or contraception, right? For Black, Indigenous, Latinx, disabled, or trans women, often our concerns are about our ability to have families and our ability to safely raise those families without being impacted by housing discrimination or police violence or poverty and the like. without being targeted by the state for things like sterilization or disproportionate child removal or incarceration of women, which makes it impossible for them to parent. Shaped, the thinking of generations of scholars, generations of activists like myself, and cause us to really think, how can we build more inclusive social movements? And so when we think about reproductive justice, which centers the concerns of traditionally and historically marginalized and racialized women, cis and transgender, in terms of the ability to make choices, to have resources about families and our reproductive capacities. With regard to disability justice, which doesn't align which departs from traditional disability rights movements by thinking about the structures that create disablement in the first place, and the way in which those structures of power operate differently depending on where you are located on the social hierarchy, along the lines of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and so on. We can think about movements around abolition. I don't think it's an accident that the Black Lives Matter movement has been led by 3 Black women who have made, in their own work, it hasn't always been visible within the broader social movement, who have made their life's work about, for example, elevating the concerns of domestic workers or folks who are experiencing mental health or mental illness, who have centered notions of community care around families and communities as mechanisms of safety and accountability rather than punitive systems of justice. It's not an accident that prison abolition and the abolition of policing and conversations about abolition came out of the anti-violence movement, the anti-domestic violence movement, and the way in which anti-violence advocates, activists, and theorists understood that state violence was a central component of the vulnerability of cis, trans women, queer people to interpersonal violence, right? That this was a core component and it couldn't be separated out. So we see the ways in which intersectionality has reframed how we think about power and state power, how we think about violence, how we think about law and social categorization and legal intervention. So it has had a tremendous impact, which is why I think it has been so savagely attacked on the right.
So that actually brings me to one of my questions, which is that, it is a concept that really is not universally admired. And in fact, there are many people who aren't even aware of it. But can you talk about some of these critiques, both on the left and the right? And what are some of and how would you respond to them?
Yeah, so I'll talk first about some of the critiques on the left, and then talk about some of the popular critiques on the left, and then talk about some of the popular critiques on the right, which are sort of front and center right now in this sort of Donald Trump, post-Trump administration era. So one of the critiques that often feminist theorists, queer theorists, and activists have made is that intersectionality is simply about articulating an endless number of social categories, and that it perpetuates classifications and binaries, which we should seek to destroy or dismantle. So that's one, and I think that's one of the most central. And I think that the response to that is that actually intersectionality is not seeking to construct categories. It is actually articulating descriptively the way in which law and social policy constructs these social categories as mechanisms of social power, right? So because it comes out of law and it uses the legal methodology, and because law is so wedded to social categories, intersectionality obviously attends to that, but it does not seek to create additional social categories along the lines of different vectors of identity. It is simply attending to the way in which law constructs those categories and uses those categories as mechanisms of social power. So at base, intersectionality is not, as Kim Crenshaw said, a totalizing theory of identity. It is a theory about power. And that's why it's being so savagely attacked on the right. because it has given activists, people who experience state violence, and to be clear, this is state violence that is deadly, the kind of state violence that we were attending to just a few hours ago when we heard families, particularly mothers, talk about the experience of losing their children, which is a concern, for example, of reproductive justice, or of women, cis and trans women, who are coming forward talking about their experiences of being sexually violated by members of law enforcement, or people who were being excluded systematically from housing, employment, and education. But instead of having social resources in those arenas, were being subject to policing and criminalization as a means to respond to these kinds of social problems. It has given these communities, it has given folks who are impacted by these deadly forms of state violence and structural exclusion language to describe the way in which power is operating on their lives and on their bodies and in their communities. And it's giving them mechanisms to respond and ideas with which to create and articulate a new kind of world. And so as a result of that, as a result of the efficacy of intersectionality, you see folks on the right attacking it as simply identity politics, as creating divisions among the population in the United States. You have people like Alan Dershowitz saying that it's anti-Semitic, which I don't know where you would even get that from, right? But intersectionality has become this sort of green screen that the right is using to project all of the various sort of wedge issues. And what started with intersectionality has now extended to critical race theory, where any kind of conversation about inequality is being described as indoctrination, as being described as anti-American. It's extended to the 1619 Project. So we see the way in which the efficacy of interventions related to intersectionality, Black feminist theory, critical race theory, is being used by the right to try to demonize individuals who raise questions and who formulate movements and formulate frameworks to contest structural inequality, to label them as the ones who are racist, to label them as the ones who are engaged in quote unquote identity, toxic identity politics and so forth. And so we see these movements expanding across the country to prohibit critical race theory from being taught in, K through 12. Right, if your child is learning critical race theory, I think I saw somebody tweet about this. You should be grateful, because that means your child is in law school, or it means that your child is in graduate school, right? And your child is not in graduate school. So, this idea that critical race theory is spreading somehow across the country because of its efficacy in informing analyses of power speaks to, I think, the importance of its insights and the efficacy of what it's actually achieved. So what we're seeing is a backlash to, I think, it's really direct and important insights about how power operates through law, through our courts, and through social systems in the broader society.
Thank you so much. So I'm wondering if you can talk about intersectionality from a global perspective. How much do movements connect to this concept? I'm thinking about sort of Black Lives Matter really being something that became global, both, communities of people who are, descendants of people who were enslaved in the Americas, but also in many countries around the world where people marched on the streets in support last year. And so does intersectionality also connect with movements around the world? Because the reality is, in many countries around the world, there are these ways to categorize and create hierarchies, whether because of the colonial legacy or patriarchy or other forms of discrimination. So I just love your thoughts from a global lens about these connectivities.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about this. I can't claim to be an expert in terms of how intersectionality has traveled globally. But I can say that it has certainly been aligned with feminist scholars and feminist theorizing and theorizing around colonialism and anti-colonialist movements. in the global South in particular, particularly in places like Brazil. It has had a profound impact on thinking about inequality and structural exclusion in places like Europe, where, for example, Muslim communities are targeted, immigrant communities, particularly from Africa, have been targeted in places like Europe for deportation, where people of color in places like France and in other countries who have been residents and citizens for generations are perpetually described as foreign and very rarely as members of the actual polity or community, and the way in which the erasure of race actually allows for the perpetuation of it, right? In ways that are similar to the critique that Crenshaw made of de Graffenried, right? So the fact that we cannot name race in places like Brazil, for example, which claims to have a racial democracy, or France or other European countries, makes it impossible to remedy the racism and the racial discrimination, the racial violence that's experienced by different communities in ways that are, again, different, but in some ways similar in terms of their logic, along the lines of immigration status, along the lines of family origin, along the lines of religion or ethnicity, and along the lines of gender. So I think intersectionality has certainly had an impact in terms of the way that people describe how state power is operating in different contexts internationally, in the global South and in Western European countries and so forth. And so I think it has had tremendous traction in those arenas as well.
So I'm wondering about your thoughts about, both academics as well as activists who point for a need for stronger organizations, community organizations that are Black-led, for example, or that are led by communities that are particularly affected by a particular social injustice or economic injustice. How does intersectionality fit with that in terms of thinking about approaching communities and issues from these multiple lenses and frameworks?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think at the end of the day, what you're describing is the notion that people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, because they have experienced dislocation, marginalization, and violence from multiple forms of exclusion. So it's not, for example, in the context of an immigrant who's trans, who's poor, right? They may be experiencing racial discrimination. They may be experiencing discrimination on the basis of gender. They may be experiencing discrimination or violence as a result of their economic location. And so centering movements around those who are the most vulnerable, using an intersectional analysis, allows us to identify the broad ways in which power is operating and the broad ways in which social systems are operating, to identify the ways in which they intersect, not only in terms of an identity, but the ways in which power is intersecting. So lifting up the experiences of Black women in my work, for example, of the carceral state. It helps us to understand the ways in which prison not only regulates racialized bodies and communities, but it also regulates the ways in which racialized bodies and communities can express themselves around gender, sexual orientation, the way in which it disrupts families, and the perpetuation of generations, what Orlando Patterson calls natal alienation. It also helps us to understand the way in which the carceral system isn't exclusive to policing in prisons. Its logics are embedded in systems like social welfare institutions and hospitals, where there have been cases of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women are tested for drugs without their consent and subject to arrest for harming fetal life, for example, if they're for pregnant women. It helps us to understand the way in which hospitals and prisons facilitate reproductive abuses when predominantly Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women experience shackling during labor and childbirth, or forced, coerced sterilizations, or disproportionate child removal. So when we can see the way in which these various systems intersect and overlap, it gives us a more comprehensive view of state violence, and of state power. And it gives us more comprehensive tools to addressing the ways in which state power and state violence is operating in our communities and in our lives.
So that's a great point, because I think one of the things I have become more aware of, particularly through the class with Professor Crenshaw, but also through my own kind of work and reading and reflection, is a lot of emphasis in recent times has been around the role of the police and the criminal justice system. But the reality is state surveillance, control, violence really extends to so many different agencies that for privileged communities are often encounters that are supportive or nurturing or help them accomplish certain individual or collective goals. So everything from education, like I'm thinking about sort of probation officers and sort of police in schools, the whole kind of, kindergarten to prison pipeline that occurs in many communities of color. In every sector, you mentioned child welfare, thinking about sort of the foster care system. So I'm wondering sort of how does one tackle this, like specifically with this intersectional approach, like what are some specific tools or examples or frameworks? Because most people who are in organizations, frankly, like whether it's academia or philanthropy or not-for-profits or think tanks, there is often like a top-down approach that often mirrors the inequities in society that one is trying to tackle. So how do you take this on? How do you make change happen with this intersectional lens?
Well, that's a big question. One, I think, is broadening the lens in terms of how we identify leaders, how we describe movements, and how we describe various forms of state violence and structural exclusion. So that's one. How we think about our legal strategies. So I can give you an example from my own experience. And I wrote about this in a paper called The New Racially Restrictive Covenants. We often think about police profiling in terms of the experiences of Black and Latinx men being disproportionate, and it's certainly the case, being disproportionately stopped by law enforcement when, driving in cars, walking down the street, simply being present out in the world, and disproportionately being stopped, searched, which leads to all kinds of downstream effects in terms of police violence, in terms of arrests, criminalization, prosecution, incarceration, and so forth. And we clearly understand the way in which that pathway to criminalization, incarceration, and hyper-incarceration functions, right? You can look at, canonical texts like The New Jim Crow, where as much as I appreciate that book and the work of, the brilliant work of Michelle Alexander, right? She even notes in the introduction that she is not talking about women. Right. So as a result of the failure to talk about women in terms of how we understand policing and hyper-incarceration in the United States and mass criminalization, we don't understand the ways in which gender also shapes. Gender is policed, the ways in which reproduction is policed, the ways in which families are policed. And I can give you an example of sort of an intersectional legal approach that resisted that sort of single axis framing. So in a case called Williams versus the City of Antioch, a number of civil rights organizations led by Black women, led by Latinx women and other women of color began to investigate a series of claims that were being made by Black women in a formerly sort of white suburban town who were using Section 8 vouchers to ensure that they had safe and secure housing for their families. The police in the city of Antioch were leveraged by the city council because there were concerns about the number of Black families that were moving into the city of Antioch, and is sort of disturbing their sort of notions of community cohesion and safety. And the police were deployed in such a way that they followed women's children. If Black women who were using Section 8 subsidies called the police for help, for example, if they were experiencing domestic violence, the police used those occasions to investigate the women, to search their homes for unauthorized occupants and to threaten their housing. And so the sexual intimacy of women was being regulated by the police. Their reproductive choices were being regulated by the police as sort of non-normative or deviant as a basis for criminalization or criminal surveillance. Their child rearing practices and their ability to have safe and secure housing was being threatened by criminalization. And since that case was litigated, we've had important examinations of these issues around policing, gender, race, and housing from people like Matthew Desmond and others. But we see that policing is a critical mechanism by which Black women's choices and Black women's safety is threatened. And so using that kind of a legal strategy gave us an insight into the various tactics and ideologies that were being used by law enforcement that rested on notions of deviance along the lines of gender as it intersected with race, sexual orientation, class, and so forth. So using those kinds of strategies where you recognize the leadership of the folks who are most impacted, where we believe their stories and we elevate them to analyze broader structural issues in ways that are not along the lines of a single axis, but we view them as systems that are overlapping and complementary in ways that are devastating to our communities.
So I'm going to ask a question from the audience, and this touches on some comments that you've already shared, but maybe you can just talk about it a little bit more. The question is, can you please talk a little bit more about motherhood in relationship to intersectionality and also reproductive justice?
Sure. So, if you look at the work of people like Dorothy Roberts, Angela Davis, Michelle Goodwin, I'm just talking about folks in the legal academy and folks in other fields. One of the ways historically and contemporarily that Black women, Indigenous women, Latinx women, disabled women have been subject to state violence is by targeting their reproductive capacities. And this is a part of histories of attempts to control populations within the United States and the racial demography of the United States or the racial quality of the United States when we're speaking about disability and eugenics and so forth. And so Black, Latinx, Indigenous, disabled women have long been targeted for things like sterilization, right? At the same time that the state may be criminalizing abortion, right? That sounds familiar. They also target populations that I just described for sterilization as a part of a means of controlling the racial character and quote unquote quality of the population. And so notions of motherhood are deeply attached to that history of targeting, that history of sterilization, that history of regulation of reproductive autonomy. And so Black women have largely been described as incompetent mothers, as deviant, and therefore in need of some kind of discipline. And that comes not only in the form of social welfare, family caps, searches of Black women's homes because of the idea that they simply are incompetent to raise their own children who grow up to be, for example, criminals. It also justifies the criminalization of Black communities more broadly, the idea that they haven't been parented well. And this isn't just me saying, right? This isn't just, Black feminist scholars and feminist scholars or race scholars saying this, right? You can look to official reports like the Moynihan Report, which argued that Black women were pathological because they were disproportionately heads of families, emasculating Black men, which causes a corruption or perversion of Black families, which leads to social chaos and criminality. Note that articulation of the deviance of Black women as mothers elides the role of white supremacy. It elides the histories of Jim Crow and enslavement. And it elides the contemporary history of policing, criminalization, housing dislocation, employment discrimination, lack of available options for healthcare and the like. And instead, it makes individual accounts for these broader social problems. So as I think George Lipson said, right, instead of seeing people with problems that are caused by these broader structural and historical forces, we see the people as the problems that need discipline through educational systems, that need discipline when they seek support from the state, that need discipline through the criminal legal system. And it's not just Black women, it's also their children, Black men and boys, Black girls, trans people. We can talk about how particularly Black trans people are characterized as deviant in terms of their gender expression or identity. So there are a lot of ways in which reproductive capacities, sexual expressions of sexual desire, and cis and trans women's Black identities as Black women's identities as mothers are used as part of a broader narrative of pathology, which justifies criminalization, incarceration, and so forth, rather than explanations that are structural, which would call for structural reforms. I said a lot there, and that was
it's a lot. It's amazing. So I'm wondering if you can talk about immigration, which is on our minds, right? I mean, all of us have seen the horrific pictures of Haitian refugees on the border and the way they're being treated. And I'm wondering about bringing this intersectional lens to this matter of immigration, because on the one hand, there's this narrative, this framing that America is a nation of immigrants, and it's welcome immigrants, and you have the Emma Lazarus poem and so on. But then at the same time, the reality is the history of migration to this country has been one that has been racist from its origins since, for the past several centuries. And so how would you bring an intersectional lens to this matter? And what recommendations would you have either for policymakers or organizers interested in immigration reform or overhaul?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not someone who studies immigration, that deeply, but I certainly have been in conversations about immigration. And immigration is a part of that broader project that I was describing, which is about population control, the racial demography of the United States. And so while we focus on our conversations on, the southern border, right, there's very little is said about immigration from Europe or Canada or other countries that have predominantly white populations, right? We focus instead on South America. We focus on the Caribbean, to a lesser extent, Africa, right? And so we have a racialized system of population control that is facilitated through our immigration laws. For most of our country's history, in order to be naturalized as a US citizen, you had to be, quote unquote, a free white person. Immigrants who were coming from what was then sort of a racialized Eastern Europe were described through eugenic ideologies as imbeciles, right, that threatened the quality of American society. So we see, again, immigration being used as a mechanism of racialized population control. And I think for number one, we need to name it as such, right? And it also operates along the lines of anti-Blackness in particular, right? So we can think about how Black immigrants, particularly as you noted, Haitian immigrants are treated in comparison to, for example, their neighbors not too far, their neighbors who are not too far from them from Cuba, right? How Haiti has been punished systematically by the United States since independence. And simultaneously, the way in which Black immigrants are largely erased from narratives about immigration policy. Despite the fact that if you go to immigration detention centers across the country, you will see a significant number of people of African descent, whether they're from Latin America, whether they're from the Caribbean or from Africa. You will see people of African descent who are being targeted, and yet we don't talk about the anti-Blackness within our immigration system. We can also talk about histories of immigration control that are derived from enslavement. There have been a number. I can't think of the name of the piece, but and I'll try to forward it to you if I can find it. But there's a brilliant piece that talks about how the immigration enforcement infrastructure was modeled after the infrastructure of slave catching and modeled after the Fugitive Slave Act in terms of boundaries and the expansion of the United States. So in other words, if we think about these overlapping histories of imperialism, colonialism, dispossession of indigenous lands, and the enslavement of African peoples, right? It helps us to understand how borders have even been constituted, how population control was central to the creation of the United States, the establishment of borders, the creation of different immigration standards around who could be naturalized into this country, and how Border Patrol, for example, has been constituted and replicated around, for example, slave catching. So when we think intersectionally about the various histories and systems and bodies that have been deemed deviant or threats to the sort of racial health of the United States, I think it helps us get a clearer picture of how immigration is a form of racialized population control that derives from these histories.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could share some resources for our audience if they wanted to learn more about this, if there are particular authors or books or articles that you would recommend.
When you say this, what do you mean?
This topic of intersectionality, just
sure.
we've delved into this.
So I would say look to obviously Kimberly Crenshaw, her work, the two pieces that I mentioned, mapping the margins and demarginalizing the intersections. If you want to look at Black feminist theorists that sort of informed intersectionality, you can look at the work of people like Angela Davis, Patricia Hill Collins. You can look at contemporary theorists that are writing in this area, historians like Saidiya Hartman, Sarah Haley, that are attentive to sort of the histories in terms of how Black women have experienced these various forms of subjugation. If you're looking at particular areas where Black women, Indigenous women have been particularly impacted, Latinx women, you could think about people like, Jennifer Chacon, who's written about the border as a form of gender control. So a lot of folks. I can send you a list, and perhaps you can circulate that to your audience or to the folks who may be enrolled in classes that you're teaching.
Yeah, that's amazing. So one other question I have about this is, about movements that are trying to hold government accountable. And I'm wondering about sort of is the focus around kind of legal reform, government accountability, or is it about changing societal norms and educating, like civic education, or is it both? What kind of an approach do you think needs to?
I think it's all of the above. I think it's a product of the imagination. It's also a process of retraining our imagination to think about the kinds of worlds that can exist outside of our carceral system, for example. What safety looks like, what accountability looks like outside of systems of policing or prisons or carcerality, what movement looks like, what belonging looks like outside of commitments to borders and so forth. So I think it's about all of those things that you're describing, right? When you think about law reform, when we think about reform of structures, when we think about reform of cultures and reform of our own imagination, right? Thinking more broadly about what justice looks like, what anti-racist movements look like, what feminist movements look like. So I would say it's all of the above.
I love that, thinking more broadly and thinking creatively and imagining really a more just future.
Yeah,
that's
as
more
you said,
inclusive.
right. Freedom dreams, right? If you're going to quote Robin Kelly, who you mentioned earlier, right? Or people like Miriam Kaba, right? Who really invite us to think deeply about this. Andrea Ritchie is another one. Another person whose work I deeply admire, who really pushes us to think broadly. Dean Spade, right? Thinking about mutual aid and how that can help us think about how to reorganize our communities. So there are a lot of people and a lot of ideas that are in conversation with intersectional frameworks or rely on intersectional frameworks that can help us think about the kind of world that we want to inhabit, particularly in this pandemic moment that's really causing us to rethink the social structures that allowed for this devastating series of events to happen globally.
And does intersectionality have anything to say with respect to sort of capitalism, or is it agnostic, really, a framework that really, in any society, whether it's communist or socialist or a liberal democracy, we recognize that there are power structures and there are ways in which humans divide and, create hierarchies. So what is the commentary with respect to capitalism and, more radical traditions?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the work that Kim Crenshaw's done, or the work that other folks who are intersectional feminists, for example, there are deep critiques, for example, of capitalism, deep critiques of neoliberalism in the way in which they create scarcity and justifications for state violence and abuse, nationalism, for example. So I think, or colonialism, there are a number of different critiques that are embedded within and have been expressed through the work of intersectional theorists in a number of different fields. So absolutely, there are insights about how capitalism operates along the lines of race, gender, sexual orientation, and how race is embedded within capitalism. So to the extent that we want to dismantle systems of racial oppression, then we have to attend to capitalism. So absolutely, it does have something to say about it, but I don't think it's exclusive in terms of having the critique of capitalism as opposed to other social systems.
So here's a question from the audience, which I think ties into our earlier discussion around sort of reimagining or, being more creative in our thinking. And it's about the role that you think intersectionality has in our future.
The role that I think intersectionality has in our future, I think it is the future. I think it helps us to imagine the future. And how we all fit within it, and how we can be held and cared for and seen in the future. So, that may be sort of a really broad answer, but I think it helps us to provide a roadmap to identify the social systems, and to dismantle them, right? And I think that intersectionality is not the exclusive tool, but I do think it's a vital theoretical tool for helping us to imagine a different kind of world.
Terrific. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.